I call the Shadow Secretary of State, Chris Philp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me start by paying tribute to the brave police officers up and down the country who on a daily basis put themselves in the line of danger to protect us and to protect our constituencies. Every morning when an officer puts on his or her uniform, they don't know what they might encounter during their working day. They don't know if they might be attacked. Yet they take that risk to protect us. And I'm sure the whole House will want to join with me in expressing our thanks and gratitude to the work those brave men and women do on our behalf every single day. And I remember, as Police Minister a year or two ago, being moved at the National Police Memorial Service, which that year was held, I think, in Cardiff, marking the memory of those officers who had lost their lives in the line of duty. I remember meeting the families of those officers whose lives had been devastated by their wife or husband or son or daughter or father or mother who had lost their lives. And I'm sure all of us have come across cases like this in our own constituency. I'm thinking particularly now of Sergeant Matt Ratner, who lost his life in the Croydon Custody Centre a few years ago, and his memorial I attended. And of course all of us will be thinking of PC Keith Palmer, who lost his life not far from here, protecting us in Parliament. We owe them all a debt of gratitude. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to just start by addressing one or two of the broader points which the Home Secretary raised in her speech before turning to the substance of the bill. And the first point I would like to pick up on is the question of police officer numbers, which she spoke about quite extensively. Picking out, I noticed, a particular subset of police officers, and I wondered why it was she kept picking on this one particular subset of police officer numbers, and I think I know why, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's because police officer numbers in total last March, March the 31st, stood at a record ever number, 149,000, one second, I'll give away in a minute, 149,679. That is more police officers than we have ever had at any point in our country's history. Now, what an appealing choice. Of course, I'll give way.
Thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. He's making an important point. Does he accept that between 2010 and 2024, the population of the UK increased, but also the nature of crime and complexity of crime increased? I often meet police officers in my constituency and across Greater Manchester who are stressed out, who are working very long hours and often covering for other officers. So does he accept that the argument that he's making is slightly flawed because the population has increased, complexity of crime has increased, and the amount of time officers spend on tackling crime has also changed?
Well, as I said, record ever numbers of police officers. But actually, probably the relevant, if the Honourable Gentleman wants to measure police officer numbers against demand, one of the relevant metrics to consider, of course, I'm just going to answer the question, if I may. One of the relevant metrics to consider is the overall volume of crime that the police have to investigate. That might be the number one looks at in deciding if police numbers need to go up. I'm just going to actually make the point first, if I may. Now, according to the Crime Survey of England and Wales, which according to the ONS is the only statistically meaningful measure of crime, between 2010 and 2024, just to pick a couple of arbitrary dates at random, overall crime fell from 9.5 million incidents to 4.7, a reduction of 51%. So, over that period of time, we saw a 51% reduction in overall crime, but an increase in the number of police officers to that record number. Those are the facts. I give way.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. Does the Shadow Minister recognise that sexual violence went up by 300% reported crime under his government? And also, when he talks about police numbers, would he like to mention how many police officers left because of the conditions in the police force and through mental health and physical health issues?
Attrition in the police force is something we need to take very seriously. Every year, I'm trying to recall the numbers, but from memory, each year approximately 3% of police officers, 3 to 4%, leave owing to retirement. owing to retirement, and a further approximately 3 to 3.5% leave before their retirement age. Now, a 3% non-retirement rate of leaving is much lower, of course, than most professions, but I'm sure we'd all like it to be lower. And the last government started doing work on mental health support for police officers, which I'm sure the current government will continue. But let me now just say a word about the future, because having hit record ever police officer numbers, I'm rather anxious to make sure, I'm just going to make some progress and I will give way. I'm rather anxious to make sure those record ever numbers are maintained. Now, the funding settlement announced by the Home Secretary for the police, and the Police Minister in fact, a few weeks ago, increased by £1.089 billion. They made a big play of that number. But when you go through the funding pressures which police forces across England and Wales face, and you add them all up, including, of course, the £230 million extra police forces have to pay for national insurance, the funding pressures don't add up to £1.089 billion. They add up to £1.205 billion. The funding pressures this coming financial year, which starts in just a few weeks' time, are about £116 million more than the funding increase. There is a gap. And the consequence of that gap is that police forces across England and Wales, the 43 forces, may have to cut 1,800 officers in order to make that funding shortfall up. Now, the gentleman is showing extreme enthusiasm, which I feel should be rewarded.
I thank the Shadow Home Secretary for giving way. He made play of the numbers 2010 and 2024. As a former local government councillor, I can tell him that the ward that I represented in 2010 had a full-time police officer and 2 full-time PCSOs. When his government left office in June 2024, it had 1 part-time PCSO and was a third larger. Would he care to apologise to the public of Hartlepool for that disgraceful record?
Well, look, I think I will not be apologising for delivering record-ever police numbers. I think if his local force was not deploying those officers in the best way, he should be taking that up, obviously, with his local police and crime commissioner. Now, I think in light of the number of speakers wanting to speak, I probably ought to get on to the bill in front of us. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, when I picked up this bill, I must confess I experienced a frisson of excitement. I thought, well, the Home Secretary has been in opposition for 14 years. Not quite long enough, but there we are, 14 years. And I thought during that 14-year period, she must have come up with lots and lots of good new ideas. And I picked up the bill, excited to find out what new things might be contained in it. But as I read it, as I turned the pages and scrutinised its contents, this sort of strange feeling of familiarity came over me, a sense almost of déjà vu. Quite a few measures in this bill I'd seen somewhere before. In the criminal justice bill, mostly, introduced by the last government. Now, in the government's press release, which they modestly issued a couple of weeks ago when this bill was introduced at first reading, the government highlighted approximately 35, in fact exactly 35 headline measures. And I went through checking those measures to see how many of them had been copied and pasted from the previous government. And the answer is about 23 of them. So this is a bill, apparently 2/3 of which has been copied and pasted from the previous government. Now, I know the Home Secretary works closely with the Chancellor of the Exchequer and views her as something of a role model, but emulating her copy and pasting maybe isn't the best thing to copy. All of these new offences, the spiking offence, for example, the intimate image offence, the duty to report, the new criminal offence of possessing a bladed article with intent, the maximum penalty for selling dangerous weapons to under 18s. These are all good measures introduced by the last government. And of course, and would by now have been legislated for, were it not for the unfortunate early general election. So I congratulate her. It was unfortunate. So I congratulate her for using the Control-C, Control-V function on her Home Office computer and emulating so many of the measures in the previous bill. Happy to give way.
Is he aware, he sounds increasingly like he's saying, that on the powers of the police, on the measures in this legislation, on the numbers of police officers, on resources, that voters got it wrong? And that sounds incredibly insulting to the public, and an apology would frankly be better. And is he aware that in Southwark we have fewer officers at the point of the last election, which he says came too soon? It didn't come soon enough for my electors, who still have fewer police in 25 than they had in 2010.
Question of the Metropolitan Police. The Metropolitan Police as a whole does in fact have record officer numbers as well, but they could have had about an extra 1,500 officers had their Police and Crime Commissioner Sadiq Khan bothered recruiting them. In fact, Sadiq Khan was the only Police and Crime Commissioner in the country to miss his recruitment target. I give way.
I thank the Right Honourable Member for giving way. Will he agree with me that, unlike some of the Police and Crime Commissioners representing honourable members across the House, we actually have a record of Conservative Police and Crime Commissioners who, in the case of Alison Hernandez in Devon and Cornwall, has seen the reopening of 14 police front desks across Devon and Cornwall, and perhaps they might like to take some lessons from that.
Well, she's quite right. Conservative Police and Crime Commissioners do tend to have much better track records on keeping police stations open and on delivering lower crime figures. Now, I would like to just ask the Home Secretary some questions. Maybe the Police Minister will reply to these at the end, because there are some measures that were in the previous government's criminal justice bill that have disappeared in the new ones. And I'd just be interested, quite genuinely interested, just to hear what the government's thinking is. Now, one of the areas that is conspicuously missing are the measures on nuisance begging. Now, the intention of the last government was to repeal, using a statutory instrument, the Vagrancy Act 1824, once there were new replacement measures on the statute books. And those new replacement measures were contained in the old bill. I see that the new bill this government has tabled doesn't have those nuisance begging measures. So could the Police Minister, either by intervention now or perhaps in her winding up, just tell the House what the government's plans are in relation to repealing or not the 1824 Act, and what their plans are around nuisance begging? Because were they to repeal that Act using a statutory instrument without putting any new measures in place, there would obviously be a lacuna, a gap in the criminal law, and I think the whole House would appreciate an update on that. Secondly, there was a measure in the previous government's criminal justice bill to compel perpetrators who had just been convicted of a criminal offence to appear in the dock for sentencing, and there was a power to use reasonable force to do that. There had been some very distressing cases where someone had been convicted and then refused to appear in the dock to face justice. That measure, so far as I can see, is not in the new bill, and I would appreciate knowing the government's thinking on that. My third question, in terms of omissions that I've noticed so far, relates to the new offence of assaulting an emergency worker, which was also announced by the previous government, I might add. Now, the criminal behaviour order for those people who assault a shop worker is welcome, but the previous bill, the previous version, had, as announced, had a measure that said if someone repeatedly assaulted a retail worker, I think it was 3 times or more, then they would be subject to electronic monitoring, a tag. And I don't see that particular provision in this version. Again, I would be interested in hearing the Police Minister's view on that. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, let me just turn now to a matter which the Home Secretary made a great deal of in her speech, and that is the change made in 2014 around shop theft less than £200. Now, listening to the Home Secretary and the government communications around this, you would think it had ceased to be a criminal offence in 2014. That is, of course, not the case. Shoplifting goods of any value, including under £200, was and always has been a criminal offence subject to Section 1 of the Theft Act 1968. The change made in 2014, I'm just going to develop a point, and then I'll be happy to take interventions, particularly from the Home Secretary. The change made in 2014 changed it from being an either-way offence to a summary-only offence. So either way means it can be tried in the Magistrates' Court or the Crown Court. Either way means magistrates only. It was still a criminal offence, and people could still be convicted of up to now a year in prison for committing it. It certainly wasn't decriminalised, and the government's own impact assessment says that about 90% of the convictions or the charges for shoplifting were under £200 and tried in the Magistrates' Court. So if it was ineffective, why were 90% of charges under £200? Now, she claims this will herald some sort of extraordinary change in the way shoplifting is treated. But I would respectfully refer the Home Secretary to her Economic Note 1007, page 28, paragraph 144, which I'm sure members here have all read. And in that paragraph, it says that the central scenario in the government's impact assessment says that the number of charges with this change will remain constant. The government's own impact assessment says there will be no change in the number of charges as a result of this alteration. So when the Home Secretary points to this as some kind of silver bullet, I'm afraid to say her own impact assessment says something very, very different indeed. Now, there is actually a potentially adverse consequence of this, and this is quite a serious point, and I would just ask the Home Secretary to think about this, genuinely quite carefully, because what's going to happen when this offence is made either way rather than summary only is lots of people who are charged will elect to have a Crown Court jury trial. Now, that will have a couple of instead of a Magistrates' Court trial. Now, a Magistrates' Court trial generally gets heard for a not guilty plea in a matter of 6 or 8 weeks. It's relatively quick. A Crown Court jury trial could be a year and a half to be heard. So the first thing I would just caution is that instead of these not guilty, I'm making quite a serious point, it would just be good to think about this. Instead of these cases being heard in the Magistrates' Court in 6 to 8 weeks, there could be a circa 1.5 year delay, which I'm sure isn't the government's intention, but that is what will happen if this change is made. The second adverse consequence is that if lots of these shoplifting cases currently heard in the Magistrates' Court end up in the Crown Court before a jury, very valuable and scarce Crown Court jury trial time, which should be used for serious cases like rape and murder, GBH, all of those very serious offences, instead of that valuable and scarce court time being used for those more serious offences, it'll get taken up with this. So, look, I understand she wants to send a signal, I really do, but I would just ask the government just to reflect carefully on the potential unintended consequence that this change may have. I'm making this as a serious point, and I would really ask the government to give it consideration, because it may end up having the opposite effect to that which they intend. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are one or two things which I would like to further just talk about that the Home Secretary raised. And the first of those is knife crime. There are some measures in this bill designed to address knife crime, which we will support. And I'm sure all of us here would want to fight the scourge of knife crime. It's responsible for about 1/3 of all homicides. And I'm sure almost all of us will have encountered a constituency case. I'll never forget attending the funeral of 15-year-old Eliane Andam in Croydon, who was murdered on the morning of September the 27th, 2023, at 8:30 a.m. on Wellesley Road in central Croydon by a 17-year-old perpetrator with a knife, and seeing the grief her parents suffered and her little brother Kobe is something I will never forget. So I'm sure we're all going to want to fight knife crime for that reason. So in addition to the measures in this bill, which we will support, I'd be grateful if the Police Minister would confirm that the hotspot patrolling in areas where knife crime is a problem that was started in the last government will be continued and the funding will continue. I think that really could make an important difference. But it's also, I think, important that stop and search powers are used. Now, in my view, taking knives off the street is the most important thing. In London, stop and search takes about, or in the past, took about 400 knives a month off the streets. Knives that could have been used to kill someone like Eliane. I'm concerned that stop and search is going down for misplaced concerns about community tension. So I would encourage the government to get police forces to use more stop and search and to perhaps amend legislation, including Pace Code A, to make the use of stop and search easier. I spoke to a police officer in Croydon just last Sunday about stop and search, and he said he felt that they're worried about misconduct proceedings if they use the power of stop and search. So I would like to make it easier for police officers to use those powers to protect the public. I'd like to hear the government's views on that, but this is an area where we are minded to table amendments to give the police more confidence to use those stop and search powers to save lives like Eliane's. Now, I also, when Police Minister about a year ago, provided some funding to invest in exploring new technology to scan for knives at a distance, so a distance of maybe sort of 10 metres, not very far, which would mean people walking down the streets in areas where knife crime is a problem could be scanned, and if they held a knife, had a knife concealed on their person, it would be identified. Now, that technology about a year ago was emerging. I put the money behind it to try and explore, to basically develop it to the point that it could be deployed. And I was told by the company doing that, and by the Home Office officials, that by about the spring of this year, spring 2025, a version of that technology would be available that could be used experimentally on the street. So I'd be really grateful to know, maybe in an intervention now, if the Police Minister could, whether that work has been carried forward, and if that scanning technology is ready to deploy, because it really could, I think, help take knives off our streets and save lives. I mean, I'd be happy to take an intervention now, or perhaps later. No, she'll come back later. OK. Well, of course.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. It does seem to me that the good work that the government's doing in this bill by criminalising the possession of knives with intent is going to be undermined if you have to wait for somebody actually to take out the knife and commit an attack before you can discover whether or not they've got a knife. So surely, if there's a separate offence arising from mere possession, it's particularly important, as my right honourable friend says, to take measures which will enable you to discover that someone possesses that knife before they've had a chance to do harm with it.
Yes. My right honourable friend is absolutely right. If we're going to prosecute these offences and put more potential perpetrators in prison and critically protect the public, we do need to detect more knives that are being routinely carried on our city streets, and that does mean more stop and search, and it does mean the use of knife scanning technology of the kind I just described to identify those knives before they're used. My right honourable friend puts it very, very powerfully indeed. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, other areas where the opposition may be minded to move amendments would include an amendment setting up a statutory national inquiry into rape gangs. Now, for some reason, the government have only set up local inquiries in 5 areas. Some local authorities are refusing to hold inquiries, which I think is scandalous. We know about 50 towns are affected, so having inquiries into just 5 of those towns is not good enough. I will just in a second on this point. Moreover, these local inquiries don't have the statutory powers arising under the Inquiries Act 2005 to compel witnesses to give evidence. The chairs of the local inquiry in Manchester resigned last year because even today, public authorities were covering this up. We need a national statutory inquiry, and we intend to try and amend this bill to do that if the government won't agree to one. We need to get to the truth. Local councils, local councillors, the police, the CPS were all involved to a greater or lesser extent in ignoring or even covering up these terrible offences. We need to get to the truth.
Thank you very much for giving way. We as a government are taking very seriously the culture of child grooming and gangs, but in the previous role, when you were Minister in charge of crime and policy...
Please be seated. I wasn't. You said you. Intervention, short and sharp.
During the previous role of Minister Policy and Policing, the Honourable Member attended 352 meetings. Could you please explain why not one single one of those was on child grooming?
Well, of course, as you will know, that falls into the portfolio of the Safeguarding Minister, who, during our time in office, had dozens and dozens of meetings on that topic, as she will, of course, know. I did have multiple meetings, of course, on Operation Soteria, which is designed to combat rape and serious sexual assault. Now, I think Madam Deputy Speaker is keen to move on to backbench speeches since there is so much interest in this bill. So I will just ask the Police Minister, when she winds up this debate, to update the House on the use of technology to catch perpetrators, particularly... Yes.
I'd like to thank the Shadow Home Secretary for giving way. And actually, I think there's a lot in this bill which is not mentioned, which is really good, particularly around tackling violence against women and girls, some of the legislation around stalking, and some of that work which was actually carried on cross-party over the last few years, whether it's increasing the age of consent from marriage from 16 to 18, whether it's tackling some of the forced marriage issues, whether it's the hymenoplasty and validity testing, which I helped put through in the last Parliament. But would would my right honourable friend just work with me perhaps on looking at how we can perhaps try and convince the government to look at introducing legislation around first cousin marriage and looking around some of those really serious issues and how we can include in this legislation some of the sexual offences which relate to that as well.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and I do support what he has proposed around first cousin marriage. The health implications of first cousin marriage are deeply, deeply alarming. I do support his proposal, and I think it is something we could look to take forward in this bill and put to a test in a vote of the House. Now, I really must conclude. My last question for the Police Minister in winding up is for an update on the use of technology to combat crime, particularly the use of retrospective facial recognition and live facial recognition, which enables the police to catch criminals who would otherwise not be caught. As she knows, it's something I support strongly, and I would gladly support her if this is work she wants to continue. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm glad to see so many familiar clauses in this bill. We broadly support the intent of this bill, but of course what really matters is delivery. It's making sure that those record-ever police numbers are catching criminals and are increasing the conviction rate. Those police numbers and the results they deliver are the yardstick by which this government will be measured. But I look forward to scrutinising this bill as it passes through the House and putting down constructive amendments during its various stages.